Hi guys, welcome again to my channel. Hope you are doing well. In this video I am going to discuss about AWS STS AssumeRole with some theory and a demo. So let's get started. So before going into the AssumeRole service or API, let us understand what is least privileges model in AWS or in any other cloud provider. So least privileges model says that granting your users the least amount of privileges that they need to perform their task. We can elevate their privileges selectively when they need to perform any other task for which they don't have permission. For example, an IAM user has permission to read objects from an S3 bucket, but he can't delete the object because the role attached to him has S3 read-only permissions. Delete the object, the user should assume some role which has permission to delete the object. Now in this sentence we have this word assume. So in this video we are trying to understand what assume means. What do we mean by assuming a role? So if we go by the definition of assume, what does assume means literally in English language? So assume means take or begin to have. So if when we say the user should assume a role which has permission to delete the object, then it means that the user should take or begin to have that role, and this would be temporary. So the assume role API that we will be calling for this user will return us some temporary things like access key, secret key and session token, and using those keys the user should be able to assume the role. So there is one important thing that we need to understand here regarding this is what is STS and AssumeRole API basically. So STS stands for Security Token Service and AssumeRole API comes under this service. AssumeRole API returns a set of temporary credentials that you can use to access AWS resources that you might not normally have access to. These temporary credentials consist of an access key ID, secret access key, and a security token. So this is the definition of AssumeRole API which I have taken from AWS documentation. So what it says is the user that we are talking about, for example, our user who has access to S3 to read the objects, must call the AssumeRole API to assume another role which has permission to delete the objects from the S3 bucket. So when the user calls the AssumeRole API, or when we call the AssumeRole API for that user, the AssumeRole API returns some temporary credentials to us which consist of access key ID, secret access key and security token. So these temporary credentials are returned to us by AWS STS service, and we can use these credentials to assume the role for this user. Understand it better, let us have a demo now. So in this demo what we will be doing, we will create an IAM user who has read-only access to S3 buckets. So we will attach S3 read-only policy with the IAM user, and then we will create another role which would have permission to delete the S3 bucket objects. Then in the third step, if the user wants to delete the object, he should assume the role which we created in step 2. So let us see this in action. Now I am in my AWS console. So as a first step, let us create an IAM user. Suppose the name of the user is test underscore user. Attach policy. So we will attach S3 read only policy. S3 read only access. Okay, we created the user. Now let us see if we have anything in our S3 bucket. Now we have this S3 bucket, test bucket assume role, and inside this bucket I have this file. So let us see if this user can access the bucket or not. So first let us create access key for this user. So I configured this user to run AWS CLI commands for this user. So if I say AWS S3 this user is able to see the S3 buckets. Let us see if this user is able to list the objects or not. So the user is able to view the contents of the S3 bucket. So let us check if the user is able to delete the contents or not. Delete object from the bucket, test bucket, assume, delete the key, test.txt. So we get the error access denied. The user is not able to delete the object. So let us now create another role. So as we can see, this user has permission for only S3 read only access. Now we want to elevate the permissions for this user. So let us create an IAM role. This IAM role should be able to delete object from the S3 bucket. Let us create a policy for this role. The S3 bucket, we want to delete object. S3 delete objects policy. So we created the policy. Now with this role, let us attach this policy. Let us name this role as S3 delete object role. So we now created a role. Now this IAM user should assume this role if he wants to delete the objects from S3 bucket. So what would be the steps to assume the role? Now Let us see if the user can assume the role or not. So S3 AWS CLI command for assuming the role is AWS STS AssumeRole. Then we need to provide the role ARN which we want to assume. So the role ARN is this. If this user wants to assume the role, we can give role session name 3 object session. You can give it anything. No, there is something wrong in the command. Let us see. AWS STS AssumeRole role ARN. Okay, so we get an error. An error occurred. Access denied when calling the AssumeRole operation. This test user is not authorized to perform STS AssumeRole on resource this. So the user is not authorized to perform the AssumeRole. What does it mean is, if we see the permissions of this user, this user has only the permissions for S3 read-only access. So we need to add an inline policy, a policy for this user or a permission for this user to enable him to call the AssumeRole API. So let us create an inline policy here. So choose the service STS AssumeRole. Let us say all resources. So now the user, we have attached a policy AssumeRole with this user with resource asterisk, means the user can call the AssumeRole API for all the resources, but we only want this user to assume a particular role. So let us edit this policy. So what we want is that this user should be able to assume only a particular role, which is this S3 delete object role. So let us copy this ARN, paste it here. This user can assume this role. So let us see in our command prompt. User is not authorized to perform STS AssumeRole on resource this. Although we have given the permission to user to assume a role, he still cannot assume this role because we need to do some configurations in this role also. So in this role, S3 delete object role which the user wants to assume, we have to modify the trust relationship of this role. Trust relationship means this role trusts what entities we define here. So we need to define that this role trusts the user, test user. So in the trust relationship, we need to add a statement. Let's edit this policy. So what we are saying is we are allowing the principal, this test underscore user, to assume a role for S3 service. Let us now see if the user can assume the role or not. Now the user is able to assume the role. So this assume role API returned us with access key, secret access key, and session token. So let us configure these credentials in our AWS credentials file. So access key, let us replace it. Token. Session token is a temporary session token which is valid for some time. The validity we can define while we call the assume role API. So let us now see if the user can delete objects from the bucket or not. Access denied. Again, the user is not able to delete the object. So what is the issue? Let us see. What we did is, in this, for this test user, we added the assume role policy, and this role has a trust relationship with our test user. Now in this policy for this role, we would also have to add a assume role statement which defines that this policy, this role can be assumed by a user. So let us edit this policy. So in this policy we need to specify that who can assume this role. We are saying that this role can be assumed by test user. So what we will basically do, we will say allow action assume role to this user. So now let us see if the user can delete the object or not. Again, error occurred when calling delete object operation. Okay, specified the profile name. What was the profile name for this user in AWS config file? So this test underscore user is the profile name. Okay. Now the user is able to delete the object. Let us check this in S3 bucket. Yeah, the file is deleted now. So this is all in this video. So if you found the video helpful, then please like it, share and subscribe to the channel if you have already not subscribed. Thank you.